Well, Brishee, what are we going to do now? You're the leader of this expedition. What the hell are we going to do? Elfane was, as they all were, upset. Back safely in the village of Mima, they were gathered in the men's chambers, trying to decide what to do. We helped the people of Mima prepare for this war, as we said we would. Somehow the Drafna knew we were coming. Our raid to get the shield was defeated, evidently. The prophecies were correct, and it will be used against us in battle. Well, what about Larry? Are we going to go back for him? Elfane still felt responsible for his former master, and had even begun to like him once Larry had come down off his high horse. I wish I could say we were going back for him. Brishee bitterly resented having lost Larry. He was my responsibility, and I failed. I'd go back this instant if I thought there was anything we could do. I just don't see what we could do if we did go back. Not against that many, not on their own turf. All we can do is our best to help Mima win this war and hope that Percy merely keeps Larry hostage and doesn't kill him. If we win and Larry is still alive, we'll rescue him. What I want to know is, are you all still with me in this? Dugan didn't hesitate. As he stepped forward, he looked Brishee straight in the eye when he said, I am. But, of course, we've got to do something. Elfane joined Dugan. Since it was given that Cruith would fight with her people, all eyes turned to Maddie. Maddie shook her head, not in a negative way, but trying to clear it. Events had taken many strange turns since she'd set out to prove that Larry was cheating on his test of kings. She'd taken more than a few punches in the gut and a couple of kicks in the pants. She wasn't sure she was ready to get involved in a war. She wasn't sure where her loyalties lay. Certainly not with the Drafna. The people of Mima were very much to her liking, but risk her life for them? Percy had certainly proven himself to be a real bastard. On the other hand, what could she do? According to Cruith, the openings to the Drafna domain were between her and the Grey Goose Hills, and Maddie shuddered at the thought of crossing those hills alone. And these people in the party. She'd known Dugan most of her life, and he'd been a good and steadfast friend to her father. Brishee and Cruith seemed to be the kind of women she'd like to know, to be friends with. Even Elfane, when he wasn't being a bumbling idiot or a hot-headed idiot or some other kind of idiot, was a kind and respectful man. A little young for her tastes, perhaps, but Maddie shook her head again and realized everyone else was staring at her. She suddenly knew there was only one option that would allow her to live with herself. I'm in. Good lass. Brishee reached out and clapped her shoulder. Now, let's make some plans. Cruith spoke for the first time since they'd crawled out of the tunnel. She looked tired and her face was pale as she said, I know that it's terrible that they grabbed Larry, but some good did come out of our little foray. We know 3 things that we didn't know before. First, we know there are one hell of a lot of Drafna. Well over 1,000. Head snapped in his direction when Dugan said this. Well, I know because soldiers are taught to estimate enemy forces, and besides, when we stopped and I saw them waiting for us, I tried to figure the odds. And, Cruith went on, we know that Percy is with them, and they have the shield. We know more than that. Elfane was on his feet, excited. You said you know the entrances to the Drafna towns. Is there a map of this region somewhere? Could you mark them on it? Well, I'd have no trouble marking it, but the only map is in the hall opposite the paintings of the prophecies. I'll copy it, said Elfane. If we know where they'll come out, we can post lookouts, maybe even block some entrances. We can position our forces around the ones we leave open. A lot of them will have to die just to get to open ground. I'll start on the map right away. Brishee caught a hold of his arm as he bolted past her. Just a minute. I think you've got some fine ideas, but I need your opinion on something else. Why did Percy grab Larry? I don't know. There are several reasons I can think of, none of which I like. There's a passage in the histories of the realm that tells what would happen should a prince fail his test of kings. It says that the next of kin by blood or marriage would take the throne when the present king died or abdicated. It could be that Percy is after Willy's crown, so he may have murdered Larry right away, but I don't think so. Larry may know how to operate the shield, although he may not know he has the information. Elfane paused, scowled, then continued grudgingly. And there is one more possibility. Larry and Percy might be in this together. Maddie frowned and spoke. For some reason, I don't think so. There's more to this than meets the eye. I've seen Percy twice since I left the capital, and he seemed to be a different person both times from the man I knew. I never met Larry before coming here, but I just can't believe he would betray us. Did you get a good look at Percy, Maddie? Cruith had a deep line etched between her brows when she asked this. What? What? Just now? Pfft, no, only good enough to recognize the bastard. Well, then, tell me, did the Percy you knew have a red T on his forehead? Maddie was taken aback by the strange question. Well, no, never. Cruith nodded. Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? That left a mark. Cruith nodded, and the line between her brows was suddenly erased. Then the mystery deepens, because the man we saw down there did have a red T on his head, and the Percy I saw before we left the castle had the same T now. Either that's not Percy down there, or the man you knew wasn't, as Percy, wasn't Percy. During the night that Brishee and I spent in the dungeon, I did some conjuring, and the conjuring foretold a traitor. I sent a spell to mark the traitor. It was to be a red T on his forehead. The real Percy, or the real traitor, has carried it ever since. We can't be sure what demon is down there, but in my heart of hearts, I don't think Larry's in league with it. A round of nods followed her statement. Larry might not have been everybody's favorite person on this quest, but he'd settled down to his work, and he seemed to be trying. He'd even given them information when he could about the rhymes. All who had traveled with him had sensed his change of heart and had tried to learn to like him. Cruith straightened up with a gasp. There's another reason for Percy grabbing Larry. I'd thrown him the box, remember? Percy might think Larry has the artifact. From where he's standing, he couldn't see the key. He must think Larry has it. So, if Percy doesn't know how to open the box or activate the shield, Brishee spoke her thoughts out loud, it's conceivable he'll keep Larry alive until he finds out, and hopefully Larry will have sense enough not to tell him. Unless he's tortured? This unhappy thought was contributed by Dugan. The meeting broke up quickly after that. There was little left to be said and much to be done. I know it's not your usual diet, Percy said to Larry, as Larry sat looking horrified at what was in the bowl handed to him. However, I do think you'll grow to appreciate the taste. I must tell you again how happy I am to have found you, my prince. I thought I would never see you again. I can't tell you how anguished I was while you were in the hands of those kidnappers. I only learned of their plot after you'd been on the quest for several days. I rushed ahead as soon as I was allowed. Percy kept his face straight through these lines, but only with an effort. He began to spoon up his own disgusting gruel. Larry, over the last few weeks, had discovered that other people really did have feelings, and he began to be interested in the qualities of others. He wondered about Percy, and about the story that Percy had told him, a story that seemed invented on the spot. Good reason for that. With sudden insight, Larry knew that his own survival depended on how well he could wield Percy's own best weapon, deception, against him. Despite the foul odor coming from the bowl, Larry raised it to his nose and sniffed appreciatively. I think it smells wonderful. Tell me, dear uncle, please, tell me again how you came to be here? Well, as I was saying, after I had spent a full 24 hours kneeling on the flagstones of the courtyard, the king finally relented to come after me as a protector. Larry, although looking at Percy, nodded, not in the right places, but was only listening with one ear, and only then for his nodding cues. The other half of his brain was rapidly assessing his situation. He no longer trusted Percy and felt at his uncle's mercy. For that matter, Percy wasn't listening that closely to what he was saying either. His mind was running through the possibilities. With the artifact, the shield of many uses, and Larry to tell him how to make them work, why,
He could not only rule Galaway, but the world, with his army of Drafna, who were, by the way, the best population of rampaging hordes, since you could grow a new one to breeding age in a week. And the advantage of the shield and the artifacts, he could easily take over. There were only two things he lacked. He lacked enough Drafna. He felt that if he started with the advantage of 2,000 Drafna, he could easily take Mima from there with his breeding stock and rebuild his army. Unfortunately, Drafna died almost as fast as they were conceived and born, and that's why he needed such a numeric advantage, because Percy had learned the reason why he'd been made insane and boiled, and now he had multiple uses for Larry. But he only wanted to boil him once, just one time to help the population. Then he could use a small party to raid and find some humans to keep in stock for insanity and boiling. After that, the sky was the limit. Ah, what a piece of work is Percy. Hello, Beat. Good to see you. He reminded himself, if he had Larry's knowledge to activate the shield and the artifact, well, that was the second thing he needed. If he boiled Larry and in the process Larry died, he might never obtain the secrets he needed to activate them. The dilemma presented Percy with quite a quandary. Should he infect and boil Larry first, or try to get the instructions to the shield and the artifact first? And if Larry died, he would only have more Drafna and not the use of the royal possessions. Percy's speech died down, mumbling to himself. He didn't realize he was rubbing the red tea on his forehead with one hand, while the other one rested atop the secret pocket in his tunic, which contained a slime snake's horn. It was a good thing that Percy was distracted, because Larry was looking at him with unabashed astonishment. For the first time since their sudden meeting, Larry had seen the tea Percy was so troubled by. It troubled Larry, too. It reminded him of a picture in a book that was his favorite when he was a little boy. Suddenly, things fell into place for Larry. His mouth, which was set like a flytrap, snapped shut, and his face took on a less surprised expression. He knew exactly what had been done, and he knew that what had to be done, and he knew that he had to do it. Suddenly, Percy had an inspiration. What if, during the time Larry was mad, he could be induced to reveal the secrets to the weapon he and the Drafna so desperately needed? And if that were so, then he could kill two birds with one stone, increase the number of Drafna and have the secrets, and if Larry lived, so much more the dividend. Percy would have a hostage. Oh, it was obvious what he had to do. After much debate, it was decided that Maddie would give instructions to arms to the able-bodied adults of Mima, and that Dugan would coordinate field operations. Elfane advocated an offensive war and had all manner of charts and diagrams to prove that it could be won. Brishee spent long hours trying to direct the many efforts into an effective whole. Cruith, for her part, inexplicably disappeared with two ancient women of the tribe. They went into a guarded cave with assurances that they would be out before the war started. Days went by in feverish efforts, and still neither Cruith nor her two companions stirred from the cave. Everybody toiled, making ready for war. At first, everything seemed to be chaos and endless delays, and then under Brishee's direction, things started to fall into place. Dugan was smeared with dirt and sweat. He sat down heavily across from Brishee and Elfane. "Well, I've done my part," he announced as he reached for the beer bucket and a leathern mug. Elfane stayed his hand. "All the troops are in place, all armed, all know the plans?" "Yes, everyone is ready," he said. And Dugan said it in a tone that made Elfane remove his hand from Dugan's wrist. Elfane beamed at Brishee. "Then it's settled. We attack at dawn." "No." Brishee's face was emphatic with the meaning of the word, and at the same time there was a hint in her eyes, just a hint of cunning. "We attack at midnight, when we have the best chance." Dugan thumped the table and stood. "Yes, Brishee, yes!" Cruith crept up silently behind Dugan and pinched him. After Dugan had finished cursing and wasn't quite so beet red in the face, Cruith turned to face Brishee. "We've decided. We're going to give up Mima." We're going to run away. Percy sat brooding. He knew his time was limited. He'd thought it often enough to know what would happen next, and he knew he had to get a clear picture in his mind before he succumbed to the madness. They were both infected, that was obvious. Larry was totally insane now and babbling incoherent riddles. Every time Percy asked a question, Larry spouted something that sounded like a nursery rhyme. What was worse, the rhyme sounded like it was composed by King Max, whose work never failed to make Percy grit his teeth in disgust. He was getting nowhere fast. Percy sat back, focused his rapidly disintegrating mind, and tried to review the events that led up to this moment. Percy thought back. He and Larry had been eating. He had just finished telling Larry his fabricated story of how he'd gone in search of him. Percy thought it was poetic that he attack at the conclusion of the tale and was just, hello, Rick, just slipping the slime-horned snake from its sheath when Larry lunged at him. Percy tried to defend himself, and the outcome of the struggle was that both men had been pierced by the horn. Percy knew that both of them would be boiled, and he still didn't have any clue to opening the box of the artifact or to activate the shield. Ah! Brishee held an open meeting not 10 strides away from the picket that was restraining their horses. Ross, the senior stallion of the royal stable, stood almost directly behind her. If a horse could stand at attention, Ross was doing his best. He'd been well fed, and, well, the people of Mima didn't pass up the opportunity to breed their stock with that of the royal stable, so Ross was relaxed and loose and feeling his oats. The midnight attack had been shelved by Cruith's extraordinary announcement that she and the elders of Mima had decided to give up their home to the Drafna. The decision had been incorporated into the plan that the rest of the party had formed, and they had agreed on a clever combination of attack, retreat, and ambush. And now it was time to put their plan into action. When Brishee was sure that everyone knew what their assignments were and had all the material in place, she ordered the attack with a simple, "Let's go." When Percy awoke, he was sitting on his throne. He had the shield beside him and the box of the artifact resting on his lap. There were Drafna everywhere. They were crowded into every nook and cranny of the complex of caverns, and soon he thought to himself it would be time for war. He looked around. He could see several Drafna being born and several of the dead being consumed by the living. These sights were so common they no longer bothered him. He rose from his throne, and although he felt shaky from being boiled again, he made his way through the teeming throng to the cell that held Larry. Yeah, the Drafna are pretty ooey. That's why you're going to be glad that I cut out a whole bunch of the battle, because the Drafna are kind of ooey. Ooh, 30 of them. Loose. Oh, Percy stared hard through the bars of the cage, trying to discern whether or not Larry was still breathing. He had just decided to open the door to check when Larry opened his eyes. Unsure of what was real, Larry struggled to sit up. "What did you do to me?" "That's unimportant. I need information from you. I need to know how to open the box of the artifact and how to activate the shield." "Well, if I knew such things, why would I tell you?" "Because if you don't, I'll make you insane again, and again, and again, until you tell me. You'll tell me, or you'll die." "Kill me now, then." "No, my dear prince, that would be a waste. I think you'll break or at least let something slip while you're in the throes of madness. My advice to you is..." Percy was cut off by the screams of panic he heard at the outer cavern. Suddenly, a young Drafna came scrambling in and tugging at Percy's sleeve and began babbling and pointing toward the screams. With the Drafna arrived the first faint whiffs of smoke. Percy turned back to Larry. "This is your chance to tell me, or I'll leave you here to die." Larry only shook his head. Percy turned on his heel and followed the Drafna back to the main cavern. Smoke was coming from from almost all, there we go, almost all of the access tunnels. It was billowing in huge quantities and collecting in the upper reaches of the cavern. Even as he stood looking, Percy realized that soon the smoke would reach the floor. He quickly made his way to the throne, picked up the shield and the box with the artifact. He raised his arms high and in the ensuing silence shouted one word. Mima! The Drafna picked up the word as a chant. Mima! 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 They grabbed their weapons and poured into the 2 tunnels that were free of smoke. Coughing and with his eyes watering, Percy returned to Larry's cell. This is your last chance. I thought my last chance was my last chance. It does no good to keep telling me it's my last chance if you keep giving me another chance, does it, Uncle? Larry's head had cleared a bit, and he felt better able to deal with Percy. And besides, while Percy had been away declaring war, Larry had found a slime snake's horn in a corner of his cell. He now concealed it in his boot. Damn you, I need that information. I realized that. What I don't know is if you will let me out and let me live, even if I give it to you. I mean, I can hardly be expected to trust you now, can I? Larry had a glimmering of a plan. It wasn't much of a plan, but he had only one chance to make it work. But it was all he had. Percy reached out, unlocked the door to the cell, and said, You can trust me. I've never meant to harm you. There are things afoot that you simply don't understand, that's all. Larry got up and walked to the open door. Percy stood blocking it. Percy shook his head. Not until you tell me. I'll tell you how to open the box, and if that works, you'll have to let me out of these caverns before I'll tell you how to activate the shield. Percy's eyes shifted from side to side. This appeared to be his only chance. With time, he knew he could break Larry, but he had no time. And already the smoke was filling this back cavern, too. He hadn't expected Larry to be so clever. No matter. Once he had the secrets to the artifact and the shield, Larry wouldn't matter. He could think of no other option. Done. How do I open the box? Leave the door open and come inside. Bring that torch with you. Hesitatingly, Percy obeyed. Larry picked up a small clay bowl of water. We have to heat up the water. What? Asked Percy. Why do we have to do that? Because it's steam that opens the box. Here. Put the... Beer? Somebody has beer? Here, put the box on top of the bowl. I'll hold the edge of the bowl with this rag. Put the torch under it. Keep the flame away from the rag. Percy squatted opposite Larry and did what he was told. Larry watched Percy staring intently at the box as the bowl began to heat. He knew he'd only have one chance to escape his uncle, and that chance would come the moment the box popped open and revealed it to be empty. The instant Brishee gave the order to attack, huge piles of green wood had been thrown onto brightly burning fires. Then wet canvas tents were pulled over them, and on one end the tents were staked over the mouths of the Drafna tunnels, and on the other end large billows were attached. The billows pumpers worked frantically, forcing the smoke down into the domains of the Drafna. There were 9 such stations blocking the Drafna escapes. That left 2 choices for the Drafna to evacuate their underground domain. What was known as, on the battle plans, as Salt Shaker Hill, and the other was simply called the Hole. The Hole had only enough room for 2 Drafna at a time to emerge. This was the main killing station where Dugan and Elfane were positioned. They stood one to each side and hacked at a steady stream of blue-green creatures. They hacked and chopped until they thought their arms would fall from their sockets, and still the stream continued. Now the Drafna literally had to push through their dead comrades to find the waiting blades. They couldn't stop even if they wanted to, so great was the pressure of the swarming mass behind them. Many were trampled in the tunnels. Where one fell, 20 tripped. Finally, the stream began to slow, and the 2 warriors of Mima took the watch. Despite their exhaustion, Elfane and Dugan immediately mounted and galloped off to Salt Shaker Hill, so called because the mound was riddled with exits from the Drafna tunnels. Here the Drafna poured out of several holes, and the people of Mima could barely contain them. The grassy slope was slick with blood and guts, and many from both sides had fallen. Elfane and Dugan arrived just in time, just as Brishee increased attack from all sides. The people of Mima and those of the questing party cheered as they surged forward. The smoke was blinding. It choked Percy and Larry, and tears ran down their cheeks in streams. The water in the bowl was beginning to steam. "I can't hold it much longer," said Larry. "It's getting too hot." "Hold it, damn you! I must have the artifact." At that instant, the box popped open, and Larry dropped the bowl, extinguishing the torch. Taking advantage of the shocked instant when Percy realized the box was empty, he stabbed Percy's shoulder with a slime snake horn and then pushed him down on the stone floor of the cell. Groping through the smoke, Larry found the door and rushed through, slamming it closed behind him. He ran his hand along the wall as he stumbled. Larry, you you can't leave me here! I'll die!" Percy pleaded. Larry stopped. He knew it was true. Sooner or later, the smoke would get too thick and Percy would die. "You were going to let me die in there." "No, I wasn't. I swear I was just trying to scare you into giving me the information. I never intended to kill you. You're my sister's son." I swear on her grave, Larry, I swear on her grave." Larry returned and stood before the door to the cell, looking at the shadowy figure within. He didn't believe his uncle, but the man was his mother's brother, and he couldn't murder him, not like this. "Well, I'll open the door, but, well, you'll walk in front of me, and I'll have a hold of your hair. Try and turn on me, I swear, and I'll bury this horn in your heart." Yes, it was all Percy could do. If he had been left, he would die. And since he was once more infected, unless he got back to the Drafna, he would stay insane. First he had to get out. Then he could deal with the rest of this. Yes, open the door. First, slide the shield between the bars. Percy did as he was told. Larry examined the back of the shield. Seeing the thong from which the shield had hung on the castle wall, he used it to hang it on his back. This left his hands free to handle his uncle. Then he unlocked the door, and with his hands wound in Percy's hair, they started to make their way out of the smoky caverns. Still, the Drafna boiled out of Salt Shaker Hill, although the people of Mima surrounded it completely. Few of the Drafna tried to break out in any direction except toward Mima at this moment in the battle, since the Drafna could not amass all their forces, and because they were leaderless, the battle remained a stalemate. Dugan, with his soldiers' sense of war, was worried. But by this point, so many Drafna dead, he'd expected at least a partial retreat, or at least a slackening in the flow, as more understood that they were only emerging to their deaths, or failing that, for them to try and break out in other places. None of these things had happened. Here on Salt Shaker Hill, the number of Drafna coming out of the holes continued at the same rate. The horrible people would scramble out of the hole and immediately hurl themselves at the line defending Mima. One right after the other, with their crude weapons, they would fly down the hill with fanatical purpose and no regard for their own lives. He rode around to the backside of the hill to check the defenses there. Only occasionally would a Drafna try and break through. He shouted encouragement to the defenders and warned them that the Drafna might switch tactics. He was just about to go back and join Elfane and Brishee when first Percy, then Larry emerged from one of the holes on the back side. Percy tripped Larry and sent him sprawling down the hill, then sprinted away from him and began driving the Drafna coming out of the holes and hurling them at the former prince. The Drafna understood his intent and closed on Larry. Percy ran to the top of the hill and started speaking in hurried signs and gestures. Dugan could see that Larry had the shield on his back and some sort of sharp animal horn in his right hand. 2, then 5 Drafna started to surround Larry, and more were coming to their aid. Then more low. The signal had begun to begin the running retreat into Mima was the appearance of Percy. Most of them had assumed that he would be in the vanguard. When he failed to appear, a quick council between Brishee, Cruith, and Maddie had decided to stick with the plan. Brishee thought the decision was sound, at first. She was beginning to doubt, though, by the time Percy finally arrived. The Drafna, although hampered by the fact that they could only climb out of the holes a few at a time, had arrived in surprising numbers. She had lost many of her first-line defenders. In fact, her lines were growing dangerously thin by the time Percy had finally struggled up from the backside of the hill. It was obvious that Percy had ordered the rushing stopped and was gathering a significant number of Drafna to break through her lines. Percy got the message across, and now the numbers of Drafna on the top of the hill swelled, and her own line stepped back as more and more of the repulsive blue-green creatures took their places in the sun. Still, she did not order the retreat. If their plan was to work, she could do nothing to make Percy suspicious. Her retreat had to look forced. She took a moment to take stock of those around her. Elfane stood on her right. He was bug-eyed and pale, but he held his sword in a hardened white hand and stood staunchly focused on the enemy. Maddie was in front of her, watching with increasing horror as more and more Drafna poured out of the hill. Maddie had been both a surprise and an inspiration during the battle. She was obviously intelligent, intuitive, and had courage. Maddie stood her ground like she'd done all her life. She had discovered she had a hidden talent for war. Cruith was throwing rocks from a pile that she'd gathered. Cruith was hurling cup-sized rocks at Percy. Her range and her accuracy was surprisingly good. At first, Percy did not seem to notice until one of the Drafna he was speaking to was struck by a flung stone. The Drafna fell and did not get up again. Percy turned and with eyes ablaze with madness stared directly at her. Cruith stood up straight and smiled. Her last missile launched only seconds before. The chunk of granite hit Percy's forehead with a sound like a hammer hitting a pumpkin. And Percy did not falter, although the stone did leave a big blue-green dent in his forehead, sinking the red tea. "He's mad," Brishee heard Maddie mutter. "He's completely insane." At that instant, Brishee ordered the retreat to begin, and Percy ordered his armies forward. Brishee took a quick look over her shoulder. The sun was sinking round and red over the mounds of Mima behind her. And so the sun was in the eyes of their attackers. That was in her favor. She sent Cruith and all the older folk to the rear to prepare. So far her troops were doing well. There were losses, but many more Drafna than Mimans had fallen. The people of Mima were doing well. Their retreat was orderly. They showed only enough fear of the Drafna hordes to make it look realistic, and Brishee admitted to herself, with the dust in the air that turned the remaining sunlight a bloody red, looking at the Drafna did conjure up a certain amount of fear. Fortunately, her troops held ground, and when she told them to never give it up, without her orders, suddenly torches flared at the gates of the underground village of Mima. Percy stood on the hilltop, barely breathing. He'd forgotten most of his plans and strategies. He'd even forgotten that Larry had stabbed him with the slime snake's horn. His eyes were twin pits of red as he looked toward Brishee's army and the setting sun. An icon from an earlier defeat had taken his attention. Maddie. In a surprise raid from his left flank, Maddie had led a mounted cadre and swept away 1/4 of his people with only 2 losses of her own. Percy ordered a halt in the procession to allow his numbers to build from below. Brishee immediately countered with a halt of her own troops. Maddie completed her skirmish and galloped to Brishee's side. She pulled her horse up quickly and turned to face him. Percy saw Maddie in silhouette. She was between him and the setting sun, a dark queen with blood all around her. Rage filled Percy's eyes and forced himself to wait for more Drafna to arrive before he attacked. This woman had defeated him once, and in spite of his madness, he could not allow her to beat him twice. Ross, the horse, snorted at the smell of the dead Drafna, but nonetheless plunged through their thinly defended lines toward Larry at the command of Dugan's heels. Ross wasn't happy about going to war, no horse ever is, but he could smell Larry on the other side of that blue-green filth. And although Larry hadn't been the best master he'd ever had, he did take good care of him. Not to mention, it was Larry that had got Ross out of wagon duty by carving through the hitchpin, a fact that Ross had not forgotten. Dugan led the way out on Ross's left side. The sword, clutched in his bloodless fist, was held at chest height, and he swooped down on Larry. Larry knocked the Drafna to his left down the hill and was turned toward the pounding sound of Ross's hooves. At first, jubilation swept across his features, but then that expression soon turned to horror. The way Dugan was riding for him looked more like an assassination than a rescue. He was convinced at that moment that Dugan was going to kill him. As to why Dugan would do this, Larry had no time to wonder. If he moved to his right, Ross would run him down. The big animal had no choice. His driving gallop could not be stopped in time. If Larry moved to his left, Dugan's sword would surely catch him. His only choice was to duck, and his only hope was to do it at the right instant. Fortunately, he was late. Larry waited until he could clearly see Dugan's eyes and his berserk expression before he ducked. He had no idea why Dugan wanted to run him through, unless he thought that he was in collusion with Percy and the Drafna. Just as his knees buckled, Ross once more put on speed, and Larry was caught between Dugan's arm and Ross's side. Instinctively, he grabbed hold. "Climb up!" said Dugan between gritted teeth. "What?" Larry asked. He was confused by the force of the impact as to what Dugan was saying. "Climb up, you damn fool! I can't hold you forever!" Dugan was screaming and running Ross around in circles, keeping the Drafna scattered. Larry was hampered by the shield that had slipped on its thong from his back and around his body to his chest. It wasn't allowing him to climb. He could feel the mighty muscles in Dugan's arm begin to tremble as he was losing his own grip. Frantically, Larry gnawed through the thong, and the shield fell to the ground. This enabled him to climb up Ross's neck and seat himself in front of Dugan. Larry started to ask Dugan why he had ridden at him like that when he stopped short as he saw the dead Drafna still hanging from Dugan's sword. "The shield! I lost the shield!" Larry cried. Dugan immediately wheeled Ross around, but it was too late. Already 3 of the Drafna were struggling up the hill to where Percy stood, the shield of many uses between them. Dugan brought Ross to a standing stop that almost sent both riders forward over his head. Dugan turned the lathered beast toward the thinnest part of the Drafna lines and spurred Ross back toward their own lines. Just as Dugan and Larry broke through the Drafna, Percy held the shield and signaled the attack. Brishee, taking her cue from Percy's signal, motioned the retreat to continue into Mima. By the time Dugan and Larry and the rapidly tiring Ross made it back around the hill, the Drafna were almost at the gates of Mima, and the last of the defenders were entering the tunnel. "We've lost!" lamented Larry, pointing to what was happening. "No, lad. If all goes well, we've won." Dugan turned Ross 33 points due north and spurred him to an easy trot. Dugan and Elfane, still trotting on the weary Ross, made a wide sweep around Mima. Soon they were over a hill and on the back side of the village. Much to Larry's surprise, he saw many of the people of Mima, the aged and the young who could not fight, formed up with horses and necessary provisions ready for a swift flight. They dismounted, and as Ross sighed his relief, the first of the defenders swarmed out of the underground village. It was Mima's back door. As soon as the Mimans were out, they found their places in the ranks and made ready to flee. Larry found himself holding Ross's reins as Dugan stalked away to take charge of the column. He soon had the youngest and the oldest mounted and paired with able bodies and on their way. The front point of the column headed toward a mountain now seen only in outline as the sunset flared around its peak. Larry had no idea what was going on, and any time he tried to ask someone, he was given a reply only in the language of Mima, which did him no good at all. In vain, he searched for some member of the original party to explain what was going on. It seemed to him they were losing the village to Percy and the Drafna, and no one was overly concerned about it. Abruptly, the people stepped into the diminishing sunlight from the shaded caverns of Mima and were shouting. Some had minor wounds, and all were moving very fast. It seemed to Larry that everyone knew the plan but him. He was feeling very left out. When he saw Cruith scrambling out of the low arch and taking up a position there, he went to ask her what was going on, absently leading Ross along behind him. As he approached her, Brishee too emerged, a bloody sword in her hand. But before he could ask her what was going on, he heard Dugan shout behind him, "All in order and proceeding, miss." Dugan's voice rolled across the landscape in a pitch designed to carry across battlefields. Brishee turned to wave her sword in acknowledgement. This brought into Larry's view her left arm, which hung by her side, bloody and motionless. Her face was white, and there seemed to be a strange light playing around her eyes. Her knees buckled, and Maddie and Elfane caught her by the elbows. Larry stopped in his tracks, and Ross, walking along behind with his eyes half closed, ran into him. It was a soft bump, but his nose into Larry's back, but it caused him to open his eyes, and he joined the others focused on Cruith. With a trembling hand, Cruith reached out and took hold of an hourglass-shaped stone. She set her feet in a wide stance and yanked on the rock. Nothing happened. The stone didn't move. Cruith grasped the stone in both hands, reset her stance, and pulled again. Nothing happened. Maddie and Elfane impatiently jumped forward and began to pry at both sides of the stone with their swords. Nothing happened. In no time at all, Maddie was as sweaty and as lathered as Ross, and Elfane had broken the tip of his sword and was staring stupidly at the blunt end. None of their antics made sense to Larry. Larry felt and then heard the thunder of running footsteps behind him, and he ran to his right, narrowly missing the galloping Dugan as he whipped by, his sword in hand, a terrible expression on his face. With a cry of a base banshee, he charged the hourglass-shaped stone in the wall. The others stood aside. He swung his sword with such force that the stone cracked in half. The sound of the crash had not dissipated before Maddie and Elfane were again working on the rock, prying with their swords. Suddenly the stone crumbled, and everyone stood back. Nothing happened. Cruith's quick hand snatched the pieces of the stone away, and again everyone stood back. And again, nothing happened. "Damn you to hell, you piece of dung!" she shrieked at the wall tentatively. Elfane reached inside the space so recently occupied by the stone. The first thing he drew out was a bottle of beer. It was covered in cobwebs and thickened with dust. There was a note inside. It took several minutes to get it out. During that time, nothing happened. The Drafna were rejoicing. The long-held goal passed down from generation to generation. The possession of Mima was finally realized. Already the storerooms and private chambers were being looted. The Drafna were gorging on Miman food, wearing clothes that had been left, and in the Hall of Pictures they were preparing their ultimate defilement. The Drafna were preparing to boil Percy. From somewhere, a huge pot had been brought and filled with water. Before filling it, they had drilled a hole near the bottom and plugged it with wax and a rag. And under this they had placed a shield, ready to catch the life-giving essence of madness. Industriously, they were rigging the ropes to lower Percy inch by insane inch into the pot. Percy merely rolled on the floor and raved. The madness had taken him quickly this time, and he had no idea where or who he was. The Drafna had no idea that Percy would survive yet another boiling, and in truth they really couldn't have cared less. As a leader, Percy had been just the thing that they needed. He, as their legend had foretold, had given them the victory, and they had taken Mima. They'd boil him again, and if he died, he'd pass into song and stories. If not, well, maybe they could boil him yet again. While Elfane struggled to get the note out of the bottle, Larry finally found some answers as to what was going on. He got them from Maddie. "It's all part of the plan," she explained. "Cruith and the village elders said that if that stone, which they called the keystone, was taken out, the whole of Mima would collapse, so we contrived to lure the Drafna in here. We didn't know how many Drafna we were facing. It seemed the most sensible thing to do, only it didn't work." "What went wrong?" "Well, obviously the village didn't collapse, you dunce." "Oh, bloody hell," raged Dugan as he snatched... Oh, hang on. I scrolled too fast. Oh, here we go. As Dugan raised it, he snatched the ancient beer bottle from Elphane's hands. Hi, Angela. Hey, I almost had it, Elphane complained. Dugan smashed the bottle on a rock. And then he bent over and picked up the note and handed it to Elphane. Now, you do have it. Well, except I can't read it. Give it to me, demanded Cruith. It's sure to be written in Meman. It was, and Cruith, squinting at the faded missive in the failing light, read it aloud to her people before she translated it to the members of the party. It says very simply that the legend of the keystone is false. It was perpetrated from the beginning of Mima. The keystone was set with much ceremony and many warnings. The original founders thought that if the people believed their whole world could be brought down around their ears by the removal of just one stone, they would live their lives more carefully and have more respect for the place that had given them sustenance. Once every generation, 3 young men were brought up here during the dark of the moon, and the secret was revealed. That is, it was revealed until the man who wrote this note failed to pass on the secret. He said that the secret had served just as well buried as if someone, and if someone did ever test the keystone, the village of Mima was as good as destroyed anyway. Well, that's why we don't let men get involved in politics anymore, silly asses. Well, present company included, of course. Attention had been on Cruith during this discourse, and when Dugan turned to Brishee for further orders, he was horrified to see that she had slumped to the ground, unconscious. He shouted quickly for the rest of the party to their fallen leader's side. Cruith knelt beside her and examined her wound. This is odd. Did anyone see this happen? I did, said Elphane, stepping forward. One of them stabbed her with this, he told her, holding out the horn of a slime snake. They all attacked her together, he went on. It was almost like they knew she was the leader. A shot of cold hatred went through Larry. If there had been any affection or mercy left in his heart for his Uncle Percy, it was purged by this icy surge of emotion. Of course they knew Brishee was their leader. Percy knew, and now he has Mima and the shield. But not the artifact, countered Elphane. Well, what do we do now? Said Maddie, voicing the question for all of them. Brishee, who was about to become a raving lunatic, was their leader. Who did they turn to? Elphane! The sound rolled across the meadow, shot from a cannon. Dugan faced the young man, gave a smart salute, and said, What are your orders, sir? Elphane stood straight up, spoke quietly out of the side of his mouth. My first thought is to get the hell out of here. Clear thinking! Dugan replied, out of his opposite corner of his mouth. Are you ordering us to continue the evacuation? Dugan projected the latter with gusto, proviso, and a little vibrato. And locking eyes with Elphane, he subtly nodded his head. Elphane looked back at Brishee. His gaze seemed to lock in position for a time, and then he snapped back to face the worried looks of the waiting masses. Continue the evacuation, he said. And then, after a pause, put the wounded at the front. We move no faster than our leader. Elphane's eyes seemed to take in everything and everyone. For a moment, Dugan thought he was looking at John, Elphane's father. And then Dugan realized he was looking at Elphane. Elphane, standing there, holding a broken sword. I believe I understand your orders, sir, bellowed Dugan. Correct me if I am wrong. Column forward. March, Mima, march. Go to the mountains. Follow the plan. Stretch your bearers to the front. Good. Pick up this one and this one and this one. Elphane wrenched his eyes from Brishee's tormented face. Make sure this one is kept close to Cruith at all times, he said. Instantaneously, Cruith translated. Soon 2 men had Brishee on a stretcher and were jogging along beside Cruith. The runners had set a pace to take over the head of the column, and Cruith was ahead of them. As Cruith covered the ground, the sun set. Darkness swept toward them, and they all felt the chill. Yes. There's a sail. The current occupants of Mima, the Drafna, were in an owlish state. Everything was going great. Or was it? Wait, well, what else could they want? Well, some sign would be nice. Some sign. And then the Drafna smelled insanity. From outside Mima, it was a sign. After they boiled Percy, they would follow their noses to other insanity. The column had halted, and surrounded by torches, Cruith and Elphane were reluctantly tying Brishee to the stretcher. She had begun thrashing and kicking, almost falling off. Maddie, riding Ross this time, came up from her post at the rear. Dugan wants to know what's the holdup. She's getting worse, replied Cruith. It's slime snake madness, all right. The madness is not of itself necessarily fatal, but unless we can get food or water into her, it might as well be. Depending on her constitution, she's got another day or two at the most before she's dead. Can we do anything? I know of no cure. We have to boil her. Larry spoke, his eyes on Brishee as she moaned deep into madness. What? All around Larry spoke at the same time. Well, not exactly boil her, but we do need to put her in a big pot of water and... Are you crazy? Elfane couldn't make heads or tails of what Larry was saying. Frustrated, Larry opened his shirt. Look! Percy stabbed me with one of those horns, and somehow the Drofna cured me. All I know is that when I woke up, I was in a big pot, and the Drofna were drinking the water that had run out the bottom. It was very odd, because I remember thinking that it wasn't even hot. I wasn't sure at the time what I was seeing, if perhaps it was just another hallucination or more of the madness. Then just before I passed out again, I saw Percy lying on the floor raving. They were getting ready to do it to him, too. Why were they going to do it to him? Why was he raving? Asked Elfane. Because I'd stabbed him with the horn. Cruith squinted at Larry's scars in the torchlight and then referred to Brishee's wound. It looks to be the same, all right. I wish I'd known more about this cure. Do you remember any chance? Was there anything special about the pot? I don't know about the chance. I was passed out. The pot seemed normal enough, except that it was awfully big. Oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it right now. We haven't got a pot to piss in, much less one big enough for Brishee. You say she's got a couple of days? Oh, sorry. You say she's got a couple of days. Elfane directed his question at Cruith. Yes, depending on her constitution. Well, then, in the interest of all, we proceed to the mountain where we can better defend ourselves. Larry, you keep trying to remember anything else you can that may help Cruith. Consult with the elders of Mima. They may know something you don't. Maddie, get back to your position and tell Dugan what's happened. Let's get this column moving again. We have less than an hour of darkness left and many miles before us. There was no dawn for Percy, only the gradual awakening from the madness to which he had grown accustomed. He opened his eyes to find himself lying beside a huge cauldron. By his face lay the rag and the wax the Drofna had used for the plug. The Drofna were silent, lined up in an orderly fashion that was most unnatural for them. Each one was taking a careful sip of the fluid in the shield. No longer bound with ropes, Percy rolled over and sat up. From his hazy estimate, almost half the Drofna had drunk from his madness. Stirrings and sharp cries brought his attention back to the shield. The fluid had begun to... This is where something is going on back in Galaway that I've had to take out. So you have to read the book to find out what it is. The fluid had begun to shimmer, and ripples appeared on its surface. At first, Percy thought it was the beginning of an earthquake, and then he realized he could feel no vibrations coming from the rock floor he sat on. A fine, keening hum now came from the shield, and it slowly began to rotate. The Drofna backed off in panic, and Percy sat spellbound. The shield levitated a few inches in the air, the spinning accelerated, and the fluid, so precious to the Drofna, began to spray from its edges. The Drofna moaned as one and many pushed their way forward through the mob, trying to catch a few of the flying drops. It spun faster and gained altitude, and soon it was totally empty. The shield began to move in short spurts from one point of the compass to another. In a burst of understanding that swept the last cobwebs from his mind, Percy knew that the shield was somehow trying to escape. He kept his eyes riveted to it as he scrambled to his feet, but he was too late. Even as he stood, the shield seemed to make up its mind, and with incredible speed it flashed up the tunnel. One Drofna, unluckily enough to be faster than Percy, jumped for the shield, trying to prevent his flight, and the shield sliced him through without even slowing down. His shoulders and head fell in one spot, and the rest of his body in another. The remaining Drofna were so shocked they didn't even jump on their former comrade for their customary feeding frenzy, which sudden death always brought. They simply stood and stared at Percy. He was all they had for a leader, and they were faced with a problem that they had never had in the entire history of their culture. Suddenly, there were among them haves and have-nots. Some had drunk of the madness, and some had not. Some would live twice as long as others unless they found another madman to boil. They all understood instantly. It took Percy until he saw one of them advancing on him with a slime snake horn to understand. He backed to the wall, shouting repeatedly in Draphna, "No! Please, no!" For an instant he was sure that he would be stabbed and boiled again. And then he saw heads turn around at the back of the mob. And then a Draphna standing on a boulder was pointing down a tunnel the way the shield had gone. He sniffed loudly, and he repeated the word for madness. The tension went out of the Draphna. Yes, there was madness out there. Madness for the taking. Madness they could force Percy to get for them. It was obvious to Percy that most, if not all, was lost. He had to think on his feet, and right there he could barely stand on them. Instinct took over, and Percy gave an order. After them! There was no hesitation among the Draphna. They turned as a body. The Draphna that had shouted Percy down was now at the back door of Mima. His right arm was continuously beckoning them forward into the rays of the rising sun. The other Draphna followed the obvious tracks that led in a straight line from the keystone arch to the mountain. Even without the tracks, there was a smell of madness in the air to lead them. The march had continued. Brishee and the rest of the wounded were at the front. Elfhane, as the new leader, had prevailed with his proclamation that the main force should move no faster than those that had to be carried. The stretchers were in the vanguard. Larry marched dismally behind Brishee's litter. As he walked, Larry was racking his brains for some clue about curing Brishee's madness. He was having no luck. So intense was his concentration that he barely noticed when the terrain under his feet changed from the flat of the plain to the inclination of the foothills. He felt no elation on reaching his objective. He felt only impotence at not being able to help his fallen leader, and despair in their dismal situation. Larry was lost in these gloomy thoughts when the shield of many uses struck him flat on the back, knocking him down. Instinctively he rolled over, and as soon as he did, the shield was settled on his chest. He was still lying there, staring at it, when Dugan and Maddie, riding hard from the rear, arrived. They had seen it fly past, and then they had immediately followed. "It's the shield!" Larry was too astonished to be more eloquent. He scrambled to his feet and slipped his left arm through the straps. As soon as he had done so, his body began to turn, scraping his feet around until he was facing the mountain. It's pulling me! It's pulling me toward the mountain!" Larry started walking in a jerky gait as if he were slowly losing a tug-of-war. The others could only stare stupidly at him. "Take it off!" cried Elfhane. Larry tried to no avail. "I can't! The straps have tightened. I can't get my arms out." Dugan leapt off his horse and ran after Larry, executing a flying tackle around his legs. This stopped Larry's movement for a moment. Suddenly, cries from the rear of the column distracted the rest of them. The Memans were shouting in panic and surging up the hillside towards them. Across the plain, in easy sight, was a ragged line of running Draphna, raising dust in a beeline for their present position. There! Elfhane and the rest barely had time to ingest this information before Dugan and Larry's shouts caused them to spin on their heels and look at them. Dugan and Larry had drifted a man's height off the ground and were once again headed up the mountain. Their speed was increasing. Both men were screaming in fear of this supernatural phenomenon. Elfhane was the first to find his voice. He shouted to Maddie, who was still mounted, "Follow them! Keep them in sight!" Maddie's answer was to sink her heels into Ross's flanks and lash his neck with the ends of her reins. Ross reared, and for an instant it looked as if Maddie would be thrown. But she was 6 times the rider Larry was, and she easily controlled the stallion. Ross didn't like it, but he surged up the hill, pounding after Larry and Dugan. "That's done." Elfhane turned to Cruith. "Get everyone over the next rise as far up the base of the mountain as you can. We'll have to dig in. Have the high ground. It's our only advantage." Cruith shouted to the people of Mima, and those not carrying stretchers bolted ahead to begin their fortifications. They were from Mima, after all, and they knew a little something about piling rocks. Cruith turned back to Elfane and caught him looking at Brishee. In this unguarded moment, the expression on his face said more than any words could have spoken. Written plainly on his young face were his love and concern for her. The strain of command, the fear of the moment were forgotten in that instant of affection. Elfane must have felt Cruith's eyes on him, for he spoke to her without taking his eyes off Brishee. "There's been more to this all along, hasn't there?" "More to it?" "More than just what the king charged us with. More than just finding out about the artifact and the shield in Monaghan. There's something else that has drawn us to this place and time." A gentle and wondrous note crept into Cruith's voice as she replied, "Sometimes on this quest I've wondered if we are being drawn to something or if we're attracting it. It doesn't make much difference, does it? We're here, and whatever is to happen will happen. Whether it was meant to be or it's just some accident of time and place, it doesn't matter now that we're here." Elfane seemed to leave the philosophical pondering behind him and motioned for those carrying stretchers to pick up their burdens and follow the rest up the mountain. What in the world? Sorry, there was something that popped up in the middle of my screen. Oh, Elfane arrived with Brishee and the rest of the wounded behind the rapidly forming fortifications. Cruith was directing teams of Memons in constructing hurried defenses. They already had rocks positioned to roll down and crush the Drafna, as well as low walls to fight from. Looking farther up the mountain, Elfane could see yet another team working on making a separate line of defense in case they were overcome and had to fall back. He hurried to Cruith. "You've done well." Cruith nodded. It was true. The fortifications had gone up quickly, and they were strong. How much they would help against the Drafna horde, she didn't know. I read. "We brought several days' food with us," continued Elfane. "Is there any water about?" "Yes," replied Cruith. "Up behind the second line there's a spring. It's a hot spring, but it's clear and sweet. It flows out of the rock and into a pool before continuing down the mountain. And there's more than we need." Elfane had the glimmering of an idea, but he was hesitant to express it. Instead, he asked, "Have you seen any more of Larry Dugan and Maddie?" "I sent some of the more agile children scampering up the mountain to keep an eye on them. I made a game out of it, told them to set up a relay system and keep track of what was going on. The farther the shield takes them up the mountain, the longer it will take for news to reach us. I intend to use as many of the little ones as possible for that, nothing else. It'll keep them away from the combat, and if we lose, I pray that they'll have the sense to run and hide." Both of them looked out over the plain at the ragged line of advancing Drafna. Elfane nodded at her wisdom. "As I've said, you've done well, Cruith of Mima. You've done more here in a short time than I ever could." Cruith turned her eyes and looked Elfane up and down. "And so, the man-child becomes a man." "Sorry?" Elfane obviously didn't understand. "Perhaps this is your test. You've worn many different hats on this quest. I think the hat of leadership fits you best. It may take some time for you to grow into that helm, but you're doing very well." "What do you mean?" Elfane had gotten lost in the turn of conversation. Do you think that a week ago you could have said, 'You've done well' to me without gritting your teeth?" Elfane snorted. "No." "And so, the man-child becomes a man." Something in the way Cruith said the word man stirred Elfane. It was praise, indeed, coming from the cynical Cruith. True, her words were cryptic, but he thought he understood her meaning. Her words and her attitude toward him had changed some time in the last day, and this gave him confidence, not only in himself, but also, for the first time, belief in Cruith, too. It gave him leave to speak his idea. "Cruith, he started awkwardly, I've had an idea. Before he left, he said that he had been boiled and that boiling had cured him of the madness of the slime snake. You said that there was a hot spring up the slope. Well, what if we put Brishee into the pool? Would it help her?" Cruith turned her gaze back toward the plain. She was inwardly surprised at how much ground the Drafna had covered in so little time. "I don't know," she said. I don't know how this cure works. I don't want to risk her life, and at the same time I don't want her to be a raving lunatic for whatever time she has left. It may come to chucking her into the pool and waiting to see if it cures her or kills her. I don't want to be the one to make that decision. Neither do I. Elfane was also looking at the advancing Drafna. Take her behind the second line. My duty is here with the coming battle. I'll take her, and when it looks like she'll die anyway, or the Drafna get too close, I'll attempt the cure. You, young Elfane, look to our defenses. You have the people's confidence. Don't backslide into tyranny. Let yourself lead them, not force them. Cruith put a kindly hand on his shoulder. This is your fight, don't you know? If it mirrors the fight within you. It's not a bookish servant the people want. They want a leader more concerned with their survival than his own. Elfane nodded in reply. One thing you should know, lad, said Cruith, a bit of her old humor twinkling around her eyes. Yes? Elfane was eager for any information. If you want the people to respect you, to follow you, to go to their deaths for you? Yes? Yes? Elfane asked anxiously. Best button your fly. And Cruith left him, with a cackle on her mission to attend to the wounded, and most of all to heal Brishee. Elfane looked at his crotch and saw 2 buttons undone. Cursing, he buttoned them and looked around. The Memons were hard at work and didn't seem to have noticed, although most were giggling as they labored. The shield of many uses had finally come to rest against the face of a cliff. Larry was still clinging, and the still clinging Dugan had been rising steadily for some time. Both men shut their eyes against the dizzying height. The supernatural journey over, it took them a while to find their tongues. Could you at least let go with your left hand? Larry shouted into the wind that pulled at them. Why? Dugan grunted. Because you've got a hold of something that's rather dear to me, and if I'm going to die, I'd rather die with it than without it. Dugan moved his hand further down Larry's thigh and began to convulse with laughter. Shortly he got out. Sorry, thought it was your dagger. Larry began to laugh, too. However, this only caused more pain in his arm, which was still trapped in the straps of the shield. He shifted to ease the pain, and Dugan slipped. Clawing, Dugan fought his way back up Larry's body. This action stripped Larry of both his boots, and his trousers slipped off and fluttered down the mountain, leaving Dugan clutching his naked flanks. To their credit, both men had the good sense not to laugh at their ridiculous position, or more precisely, they had the scare of a close call, and they didn't think it funny. On the ground below them, Maddie brought a winded Ross to a stumbling halt at the base of the cliff. A boot landed on her left, a boot landed on her right, and then a pair of pants landed on her head. She looked up, and far above her she could see the desperate form of Dugan clinging to the pinkness of Larry's bottom. She laughed. Sensing something comical among the humans, Ross looked up. Ross laughed. Well, not a horse laugh. Not Ross of the royal stables. Ross discreetly snickered and casually kicked a stone down the mountain with his hind hoof to express his amusement. The stone bounced off several boulders, but refused to break. Down it went at an ever-increasing velocity. An amoral missile aimed at nothing. The rock smacked a round boulder and caromed to the flat face of a small outcropping. The stone hit a small bush, and its flight was slowed. It rolled down an incline with only enough energy to make it over the top, fell off an overhang to strike Cruith a glancing blow. She fell down, a bloody gash on the back of her head, and she was laid out next to Brishee. My arm is going to come out of its socket, Larry wailed. Just as long as your legs don't. But I'm sorry, but the cliff is completely smooth here. There's nothing to grab onto. This damn thing is killing me, shouted Larry. Suddenly, the shield began to hum. What's happening? Asked Dugan. Larry was staring at it. The shield, like he'd never seen a shield before. I don't know. It's opening. And at that moment, from an impossible compartment that couldn't have existed, fell a rope ladder that was much too big to have been inside the shield. Shield of many uses. Dugan immediately grabbed on it, and Larry put his feet on a rung to take the weight of his agonized arm. Well, "I can get down now, at least," said Dugan, looking down and seeing that the ladder had reached the ground by Maddie and Ross. "Would you be so kind as to fetch my pants, Dugan?" 3 different groups of Drafna had attacked. As they straggled up the mountain, they raged in slavering mobs at the people of Mima. They were unorganized, and the attacks were easily repelled. Suddenly, the attacks stopped, and quiet came over the Drafna. Peering over the wall, Elfane saw the reason for the cessation of hostilities. Percy had arrived. Elfane could clearly see him taking charge. The Drafna had begun to organize. They formed groups, 2 of which split off to each side in an obvious flanking maneuver. Elfane's first thought was to order the Memans to go behind their fortifications and repel them. Then he looked at the size of the forces and rightly concluded that Percy was arranging a diversion and that the main body of the attack would be full and frontal. He had just, through a frustrating bit of mime and using few words of Meman that he knew, communicated, he hoped, this strategy to his defenders when a messenger arrived. At first, Elfane thought that the message was that Cruith had been killed, and then he realized that she had been struck unconscious. He tried to find out how Brishee was doing, but because he didn't speak the same language, the most he could discover was that she was still alive. Elfane was torn. He wanted to see for himself what state Brishee and Cruith were in, but he dare not leave the battlements. Strange as it was for them, Memans and Elfane included somehow. Elfane had been left with their fate in his hands, and even though he couldn't communicate with him, he was their leader. Below at the base of the mountain, the Drafna raised their noses. As the sun reached its zenith and the breezes swept down the mountain, they could smell the sweet scent of madness emanating from Brishee. They wanted that madness, or at least the essence of it. The Drafna salivated and grew animated. It was obvious another attack would come. Elfane only hoped that it would come in daylight. He somehow instinctively knew that the Drafna would have the advantage in the dark. Elfane had too many things to think about and no time to think at all. He got his message across to his messenger. Put Brishee in the hot spring. It might kill her, but she was going to die anyway. Either way, either the madness or the Drafna would claim her, and it was all he could think of to do for her with the blue-green army so close. The Meman attendants put Brishee, stretcher and all, in the pool and sat down beside her. Later, as it was getting dark, Dugan reported to Elfane. It was comforting to have the old soldier beside him. I am gonna... I did, actually. Night fell over the plain like an ocean wave and crept up the mountain like a tide. As the stars came out one by one, a sense of impending triumph came to Percy. The Drafna would attack this night, he decided, in the lonely, cold hours before dawn. In his mind, Percy saw the sun rising on a battlefield littered with the bodies of Meman. He was basking in this vision when a Drafna rudely pushed him aside. Startled, Percy realized that more and more Drafna were coming his way and headed for the stream. Then Percy smelled it too. Coming from the stream was the smell of madness. High up in the mountain, Brishee's pool drained between the rocks to form this foundation of life, this fountain for the Drafna. Discipline was abandoned. The Drafna fell face first into the water and would only draw their bloated bodies out of it when they could hold no more. It was diluted madness, not the concentrate they were accustomed to, so they drank heavily. Percy, too, had his fill. The rest of the night was given over to obscene fornication. Yes, I said it, obscene fornication. The Drafna would not attack this night. Orgy! By morning, more Drafna would be born, and the rapidly maturing adolescents would help man the front lines against the Memans. Cruith still slept. In her pocket, warmed by the heat of her unconscious body, was the key to the mountain, also known as the lost artifact. Larry remained a prisoner of the shield. His arm would still not budge from the straps. At least he had a ladder to stand on, and Maddie used it to bring food and drink to him, which he was very thankful for at first. I have got to skip forward because otherwise we're going to be here until 9 o'clock. We got that. Okay, so night passes. Everybody's thinking Larry's still up. Cruith is starting to wake up. She comes out of unconsciousness, but then she goes into a natural sleep. Okay, everybody's thinking. And nothing is happening. The Drafna haven't attacked yet. Yes, I'm making fast-forward noises. There we go. And Maddie has to decide. Here's thing. Yes, it starts to become morning. Everybody starts to wake up. And they realize that the Drafna are about to attack. Maddie goes down to help with defenses. Ross falls on the way down the hill, and Maddie ends up rolling and arriving in one big sort of clump. And here we go. Let's see. How many of them do you think there are? Elfane said, asking Dugan, relying on the professional soldiers' estimating capabilities. Well, more than there were, at least more of fighting age. And look, there's been more born during the night. It was true, many of the Drafna females were suckling their babies. The Meman children were safe for the moment. The little ones and a few adults were watching the scene with horrified eyes from behind the security of the second battlements. Can we win? This question came from Brishee. She had been filled in on what had happened since she fell to the fever, but she needed confidence as well as information. Looking again at the massing Drafna, Dugan shook his head. We can't hold this line. What about the second line? There was an edge of hysteria in Elfane's voice. I don't know, Dugan replied. Perhaps if we... He was interrupted by a shout from below, and the Drafna charged. And the battle ensues for about 10 pages that we're not going to read. But here's the long and short of it. It goes badly. Tons of Drafna are killed, but of course they don't care, and there's plenty more coming. However, a lot of the Memans are killed, and by the end of it, they've sent the children up the mountain with one adult to supervise them to try and keep them safe, and they're down to less than a handful of Memans. I do want you to buy the book, but I also want to get to the end. I don't want to leave you wondering what happens. I mean, sort of the big picture what happens, not the little picture what happens. Because there's, to mention, 10 hours. There's 10 hours of reading the book, and I'm only doing 6. So there's 4 hours of stuff that fills in the cracks. Here we go. Cruith hurried up the mountain, 'cause she's awake! Her skirts flying up behind her as she scrambled. Answers were swirling in her head. She solved each puzzle of the terrain as she confronted it, making her way to Larry. Cruith was dizzy from her exertions and the still unhealed wound on the back of her head. She arrived at the bottom of Larry's boots on the ladder. Shift to the side, she panted. I've got to get between you and the shield. It didn't even occur to Larry to ask why. He simply shifted. Cruith struggled up, and as she got to the rung that was roughly at Larry's waist, she swooned. He made a quick grab and caught her, losing his own footing as his hand closed around her wrist. Their combined weights fell to his already tortured left shoulder to support. His cry of pain brought Cruith back around, and she scrambled to get back up the ladder. Once she had accomplished this, she helped him to regain its support. Keep hanging on to me if you can, Cruith instructed him. I'm not in my best form today. No? And so, pressed between Larry and the wall of the mountain, Cruith dug in her pocket for the lost artifact, what she knew as the key to the mountain. Ah, but what mountain? All the while, she prayed that the slick sweat of fear on her hands would not make her drop the only object of their salvation. Because, did we mention things are going bad down the hill? Keep an eye on what's happening below. We're going to have to cut this close. We know when the Memans. Let me know when the Memans are at the base of the cliff. They're on their way, reported Larry as he twisted his neck and looked over his shoulder and down. That's good, rejoiced Cruith. Percy's ahead of them. Larry completed the picture. That's not good. But there's no choice in what I must do. Cruith placed the artifact against the shield, below where Larry's arm was held prisoner in the straps. The point of its teardrops sparkled as it made contact with the metal. Both the crystal and the shield began to glow, and slowly the key to the mountain began to sink into the metal. Percy had found Ross. Remember, Ross fell. And at Percy's first instinct had been to plunge a spear that he still carried into the frightened and confused animal's side. However, he soon had a better thought. Even though Ross had a gash on his side, of his head, and his eyes rolled madly. The animal seemed to be breathing regularly and was steady on his feet. Percy took quick advantage. He mounted Ross and kicked his sides violently, got the animal moving up the hill to the base of the cliff, where he turned Ross to the side and forced his horse to labor up a sand spit that swept down from the granite heights. Below, the party, now only 2 people left from Meeman, ran on, with the Drafna in close pursuit. Above, the rock was moving, a man's height above where Cruith and Larry clung to the shield. The rock had separated in a massive block. It was grinding out over them. It was as if something in the mountain had awakened and was pushing a giant's plaything off a shelf. More and more the rock's underbelly was visible to Larry and Cruith, fine sand raining down on them. Since the sun was almost directly overhead, they now hung in the shadow. At last the party had reached the bottom of the cliff, and now they stared stupidly up, trying to comprehend the impossible. Damn, your eyes climb! Cruith shouted to them. First the 2 surviving Meemans mounted the ladder and began their journey up. Then Maddie took the rungs. You go next, said Dugan to Brishee. What? I'm in command here. That's true, admitted Dugan. And you go next. But I'll not have you tell me, Brishee began, but was cut off by Elfane. No, Brishee, he's right. Dugan and I are both wounded. If we're ahead of you on the ladder, it will only slow you down. Now go. The last word was said with an authority the old Elfane could have never mustered, and Brishee went. Once Brishee was above their heads, Elfane turned to Dugan. Look, he said in his most convincing tone, I've been wounded in both arms. There's no way I can climb the ladder, but with my back to the wall, I can still hold off some of the Drafna, though I don't see what good it will do, since it appears that we're about to be crushed by half a mountain. But in case you still have a good arm, so you go and I'll stay. Yes, sir, answered Dugan, and then his face took on a shocked expression as his eyes looked over Elfane's shoulder. Elfane spun and looked. What is it? I don't see anything. Dugan deftly rapped the young man on the back of the head with the flat of his sword and knocked him out. No, he said to the unconscious Elfane. No, you don't see anything, and you're wrong. I've got 2 good arms left. Whereupon the old soldier flung the much lighter Elfane over his shoulder, secured Elfane's sword to his own belt, and still ignoring the arrow in his back, did we mention he has an arrow in his back now, began to climb. As soon as the last 2 were on the ladder, it began to retract. Larry and Cruith were in a ludicrous position of having to back down the ladder as it went up into the shield. The exhausted others had to stop climbing and were soon hauled up just below Larry and Cruith. No sooner had that happened than the ladder once again became still. The Drafna reached the base of the rock. The stone above the party was now perched an impossible 20 feet out from the face of the cliff. A huge grating shriek issued from it, and it toppled. For something so large and so heavy, it seemed to take forever to fall. The mammoth block of stone slowly revolved once before coming to rest at the bottom of the cliff. The Drafna below never even uttered a cry before the crushing weight of the block of pure rock took their lives and flattened their bodies. Quietly, the shield began to hum, and Cruith withdrew the artifact from it. Inch by inch, the shield was taking its load with it, and began once to again ascend the cliff. The shield's hum was felt as a steady vibration down the ladder. All grasped its rungs and felt a drowsiness come over them, and although their hands didn't relax their grips, they all seemed to fall asleep. Larry still stood on the ladder. The stone in front of him was rapidly warming under the sun. He was in the throes of a nightmare. In his dream, his arm was encased in the stone of the mountain. Drafna attacked him in his dream. His sword, which always hung on his left hip, would not come all the way out of its sheath when he tried to remove it. Oh, I hate those dreams. He couldn't get it past his left arm, and the shield, like Queen Dindy had discovered, trying to see the pores of her skin, sometimes your arms just aren't long enough. Larry woke to a piercing pain in his left shoulder, as in his dream. He was struggling to remove his sword from his sheath. His action had caused his feet to slip from the rung of the ladder, and he found himself hanging from the arm, still trapped in the straps of the shield. He quickly abandoned his attempts to free his sword and got back on the ladder. He panted for a moment, his eyes closed, waited for the pain to be washed away by his rapid breathing. When it had eased sufficiently, he looked down, expecting to see the high cliff face stretched down to the valley below. Instead, he saw solid rock, not more than 6 inches below his boot soles. Confused, he blinked, looked down again, and then looked behind him. Stretched out on the rock, at his back were the last 2 Memons to survive the battle and the questing party. All of them clung to the ladder as if it still hung vertically. They appeared to be in some sort of magical trance. Though they were breathing, and their breathing was regular, their faces bore clenched jaws and their knuckles were white where they gripped the ladder. Larry was just about to try and call out and wake them when he heard hoofbeats on solid stone. First he saw Ross's head as he came around the wall of the cliff, and then he saw the horse's shoulders and the tip of a slime snake's horn that Percy had fashioned into a spear. Now the horn and the shaft were tied to Ross's saddle. Finally, Larry looked up into the wild eyes of Percy. "Hello, my prince," said Percy in his most ingratiating and slightly insane courtly manner. The civility of his tone could not hide the violence that vibrated in his being. He dismounted quickly, and Ross skittered away close to the edge of the cliff. Percy cocked his head and took in the situation. "It would seem I have the advantage." "Yes," he said, nodding to himself. "Yes, it would seem so." He stooped and drew the sleeping Dugan's sword. Dugan moaned a bit as he did so, and Percy paused for a few hoofbeats with the sword over Dugan's throat. No. First things first," he muttered to himself, and he advanced on Larry. "I hope you realize that I decided to kill you when you were still a boy." And again, Larry began to struggle to free his sword from its scabbard. Standing near the edge of the cliff, the updraft of the wind began to clear the fog of confusion and pain from Ross's mind. The shrewd equine snorted and shook his head. The comforting, familiar smells of the party came and went in his nostrils as his breathing slowed and became more regular. He looked at the supine people stretched out on the rock and shook his head as if flies were in his eyes. Why were his people all asleep? All except Larry, who seemed to be trapped and unable to pull his sword. Why? What was going on here? Something tickled his left nostril, and he bent his long neck back against his body so that he could see what was raising the abdominal stench. What he saw there, glinting in the sun, almost caused him to bolt over the side to his death to the rocks below. Horn of a slime snake! There at his side, so close, too close. Then Ross realized the horn was not fixed to a slime snake, but to a stick tied to his saddle. As his panic faded again, a chance motion of the swirling breeze brought Percy's smell to him, and Ross immediately associated it with a slime snake's horn. Ross lowered his head as if he were a bull, not a stallion, and advanced on Percy. Percy stopped to gloat. Oh, see, they always do this. He was amused by Larry's efforts to free his sword. Cruith moaned, and her eyelids fluttered and then closed again. This distracted Percy, and he didn't hear Ross's footsteps on the hard rock until it was almost too late. "You just lie still, old woman. Kill you with I'm going to kill you," was as far as Percy got before he heard the steady clop-clop of Ross coming up behind him. Percy whirled, Ross reared, Percy thrust up with the sword just as Ross came down, his front hoofs trying to find a target, their sharp edges glinting in the sun. A glancing blow to Percy's shoulder was the best that he could do before the sword point found his chest and pierced his hide. The point found his breastbone, and since Percy was thrown aside, it did not penetrate his sternum. Rather, it ran a ragged path under his skin and came out at his front shoulder. Screaming, Ross whirled in a small circle and bashed Percy with his own head, not wanting to be knocked down and trampled. Percy clung to the side of Ross's saddle. Ross continued to scream and twirl. Yeah, poor baby. Don't worry. Ross gets the last word, ultimately. Scream and twirl, fighting with everything he had. He got his teeth into the back of Percy's head, and he bit down hard. Percy's scalp was like the skin of a tough old undercooked chicken and refused to yield to his teeth. Ross's bite had the effect of pulling the skin of Percy's face tight, and it was his turn to scream. Percy began to beat at Ross's side frantically with his fist. Ross froze in his tracks, stopped whirling, and with his teeth clenched, yanked backward, using all of the strength of his powerful neck. His teeth finally found their way through Percy's scalp and ripped a chunk of it free. Ow! Ow! Percy stopped screaming, not because he was in less pain. Quite the contrary. He was hurt too bad to make a sound. Searing bolts of agony shot up and down his spine and made his body jerk in weird convulsions. In fact, he would have fallen to the ground to curl up in pain if he could, but he couldn't. His arm was impaled on the spear tied to the saddle. Desperation and agony brought Percy clarity of mind. He quickly untied the weapon with his free hand, and while Ross was coughing and puking the vile taste out of his mouth, he took to his heels, knowing that once he was off this hard, level plain, he would have an advantage over a wounded horse. Ross heard the footsteps running away from him and turned to follow. He only got a few paces into his pursuit before the sword still lodged in him before, with the sword still lodged in him, he collapsed onto the rock. It was Larry's turn to scream at the party to wake up and tend to their fallen comrade. Cruith awoke seconds before Brishee, and she snapped, too, as if she'd never been unconscious. Cruith and Brishee quickly rushed to Ross's side. They took Larry's word that the horse had saved his life, indeed had saved all their lives without need of explanation. Cruith quickly found that although the sword had missed all of Ross's vital organs, he had lost a lot of blood, and it seemed best they do their work while the horse was still out. If he wakes and tries to stand, he may bleed to death. She told Brishee gently. They eased the sword from the animal's flesh, and Cruith, from her ever-present bag, brought healing herbs, fresh bandages, and a needle trailing a string of catgut. "You can't sew him up like an old rent cloak." Brishee looked on horrified. "Watch me," was Cruith's stoic reply. Just as she finished, Maddie came around and, on unsteady feet, approached Brishee and Cruith. Cruith nodded her handiwork, bit through the string. "Nasty cut you got on your forehead there, girl," said Cruith. Maddie looked confused for a quick minute, and before her eyes focused first on the sewing material in Cruith's hand, and then she looked at Ross. Her eyes widened in terror. Cruith laughed. "Oh, it's bad, all right, but nothing some washing out and a clean bandage won't cure. You're lucky. It's right on your hairline. Won't spoil your looks, although it will heal with a scar. Most won't notice it unless you get mad and it goes white while the rest of your face goes red." A moaning sound interrupted Cruith's medical predictions, and 3 women hurried to Dugan's side. Brishee quickly cut Dugan's shirt away from the arrow that still projected from his shoulder. "It's in very deep," she said. She grimaced at the wound. "Too deep to pull out the way it came," offered Maddie. Her knowledge of battle wounds, mostly confined to those suffering in barroom battles, but was no less extensive. The 3 women got the beefy Dugan into a more or less sitting position, although it took all their strength to do so. When the front of his shirt was stripped away, Cruith took a careful sighting along the shaft of the arrow and gently touched a few places on Dugan's chest with one finger. On the last place she touched, a tiny drop of blood gleamed. Maddie let out a long, trembling breath. "Oh, it missed his lung," she said in obvious relief for her long-time friend. For she didn't understand what was going on, but was quite horrified when, with Cruith's count of 3, Maddie grabbed the flocked end of the arrow and plunged it further into Dugan. At least that's what it looked like Maddie was doing. Actually, she was pushing the arrow out of Dugan. Brishee could now see the cruel arrowhead burst through the skin of Dugan's chest. It must have been just below the surface. No sooner had the arrowhead cleared the skin than Maddie cut off what remained of the shaft sticking out of his back. Cruith had pulled what remained out through the chest. Cruith's kind eyes found Brishee. "Hand me that green salve, would you, dearie-o? We don't want this wound to fester with sickness." Treating Maddie and Elphane's cut was less dramatic and time-consuming. The Memons weren't wounded at all, and as soon as they revived, Brishee led them out onto the mountainside to find water and food and wood. They found precious little of each commodity, but they found enough to make the night survivable. The fire swung rapidly, its flames twisted by the fickle updrafts of the cliff, sometimes roaring, sometimes smoky and dull. The fire at that moment was being murky and sullen. All the heat had stopped radiating. In fact, to Elphane, it felt like the fire was actually drawing heat from his own body. Instinct told him to move closer to the fire, but its vile smell squashed that idea. He wondered what the gathering party had found to burn. Oh, suddenly the chill winds were at his back, and the fire burst into bright yellow flames. His ears popped, as they did during the course of his climb up the mountain. He looked to Larry, and then he moved by the power of the light from the fires of the flame. Elfane looked above Larry's head at the shield and the rock. He squinted and stared. He couldn't believe what he saw. And then before he could convince himself that it was a letter M slashed in the rock, his ears popped again and the fire faded, and with it Elfane's vision. Elfane, along with the fire, became dark and sullen before he wriggled deeper inside his cloak, drifting away to his dreams of the royal library and orderly times. Maddie sat, propped opposite Elfane, not seeing him at all. Brishee sat with, everybody's sitting. Everybody's contemplating. Hang on. Larry moaned from his perch. His knees sagged, and that put pressure on his shoulder. He straightened up and put pressure on his trembling legs. The night spent kneeling before his father's court had taken on qualities of a holiday. Larry wished for some kind of relief. He even prayed for it, but as it was not forthcoming, he reached up with his right hand and took hold of the top of the shield just to ease the weight. That's when he heard the voice. It whispered to him, so softly. He wasn't sure that if he really heard a voice or just some trick of the wind. Son of Galaway. Son of Galaway. The voice came a little stronger now, and Larry tried to boost himself up to see behind the shield. He couldn't. He couldn't quite get himself high enough. Son of Galaway, the voice went on. Son of Galaway, unlock the mountain. Free me. The voice fell silent. Now Larry had another reason to tremble. Percy leaned against his spear and wept. He was going insane again. He knew that. He had been stabbed by the slime snake's horn. Soon he would be crazy. This is the time in all of this when I take the lid off my water bottle, because I'm just going to have to drink bigger drinks. Oh, what could he do? He had won and lost the kingdom in a day. How could he ever gain another? And then the image of Larry trapped in the shield shook him. Larry! Some of the earlier madness that engulfed him when he came out of the fog of the Grey Goose Hills returned to his heart. Larry. He must get... No, not Larry, but what Larry possessed. The shield and the lost artifact would make him king. The madness would set his brain in motion as his eyes rolled back into his head and his body began to dance the motion of his dreams, crazy or not. Percy was coming for Larry's treasures. Larry's fingers slipped from the top of the shield. He couldn't believe what he thought he'd heard. He couldn't stay awake any longer. The one true Prince of Galaway sagged against his bonds and fell asleep. From her perch high on the rocks, Cruith fluffed her skirts and spat. She turned back to her fellow Memons, fished the bag containing Charlie's bones out of the pocket of her dress. Almost instinctively, Elfane crawled over and joined Brishee for sleep, or for heat, or for something. Maddie joined Larry on the ladder. She gave him warmth as she moved up under his free arm and took some of the weight off of his overtaxed knees. Larry didn't wake up, and he didn't seem to mind. Cruith and the Memons squatted in a protected place on the side of the mountain. A circle had been drawn in the sand, and Cruith held Charlie's bones above it, loose in her hands. At 5 points on the outside of the circle, stubs of candles had been lit from an ember carried there from the fire. Cruith tossed the bones slightly into the air, too quickly to see, pulled her hands away. The bones fell in a circle. The sand held them fast, and to the symbols they formed. All of Charlie's bones were used up in this one telling. None of the bones had landed outside the circle, and none landed outside the pattern. The bones in the circle told of 3 things. The Virgin was still important. Cruith thought for a moment about the way she sometimes caught Elfane looking at Brishee, and a line of worry crossed her brow. The traitor was still alive, still dangerous, still plotting, and because Cruith and her band had asked what the outcome of this mad adventure would be, the 3rd symbol was the most disturbing of all. This configuration had at its center the bones symbolizing that of a king, and on either side fell Charlie's feet. The chicken talons pointed at each other. 2 kings? standing side by side or squared off to fight. How could a land have two kings? Once more Cruith threw the bones. This time she was asking what to do. Once more she got the virgin. She also got the symbols for the mountain, key, and blood. Cruith led the others back to the fire, and for a while Cruith stared at Elfane and Brishee where they slept with Ross. She reasoned that they couldn't get into too much trouble with the horse between them, and went to sleep. Percy's heart was beating so hard it slammed him against the rock he leaned on. He opened his eyes, stared vacantly at the ghostly shapes around him. His mind was on fire with understanding. His madness had evolved. Percy now understood that although he had control of his madness, he wasn't completely shut of it either. Percy knew that he would be mad forever, and he rather enjoyed the idea. There was a delicious edge to insanity that intensified his cravings. Not only his obsession for having a kingdom of his own, but a new need came to his senses. There were things that Drafna had taught him he couldn't forget. The taste of freshly killed human flesh, and the way drinking the essence of madness slaked the thirst that you didn't know you had. Percy's eyes popped wide open and looked. Understanding passed over them. With the shield and the artifact, Percy could have as much of either one as he could stand. He just stood up to go and spy on the party when, distantly, he heard the wail of a child. He heard it once again and located its position on the dark mountain. He was about to turn away, thinking that a child was of no use to him or his ambitions, when it cried a third time. Percy smiled. As a thought he turned around and he headed back through his brain the other way. Perhaps the child would be useful to get what he wanted. Yes, maybe so. Silently, Percy crept toward the sound. His bloodied fingers gripped the sharp edge of the rock in the moonlight. He pulled himself up and looked at what lay in the crevasse below. 7 children of Mima were huddled in the sand, asleep. One surviving adult stood against the rock face, valiantly trying to stay awake and guard the children against the evils of the night. Well, the adult was an easy target, and she succumbed almost silent to the rock that Percy threw. All that was heard was a dull thump of the stone against her head and the soft shushing noise as her body collapsed into the sand. The children, however, seemed to know what was going on. They formed a protective half-circle around the littlest. Percy considered for a moment, and then sent a rock slide in their direction. As he calculated, the children on the perimeter were bowled over. The child on the inside woke and had no idea what had happened. Percy took him and was by no means gentle. Percy knew in his heart that this snot-nosed little wag was part of his ticket to a kingdom. Ross twitched in his dreams, seeing his mare and thinking that he could hear the bells that she wore on state occasions. He sighed loudly in that lip-fluttering way that horses had of blowing breath. Brishee woke up to this wet blast of horse exhaling in her face. For a disoriented minute she wondered why she was sleeping with a horse. Then the bloody, exhausted events of the previous day flooded her mind. She slipped her arm from under Ross's neck and gave him a pat. The horse's ear twitched and his nostrils flared a little, which is horse talk for, well, had Brishee been able to interpret, she would have had a reason to slap his face. She looked around their camp and took stock of her people. The moon shone down from the very top of the mountain now. It was bright enough to outshine their pitiful fire. A sudden panic came over her. They had all been so exhausted and hurt they hadn't posted a watch. But what if... But no, they all seemed to be present and breathing and reasonably sound. Brishee built up the fire and wondered what the daylight, still so far away, would bring. She stirred the embers of the fire and wondered how things could have gone so wrong. What should they do next? She remembered her original mission, find the lost artifact in the Shield of Many Uses and discover what happened to Prince Monaghan. 2 of those objectives were accomplished. They had the shield and the artifact, but the accomplishments had presented problems of their own. The shield was stuck to a cliff, and she had no way of removing it, not to mention the fact that her unwilling servant was trapped in it. And it appeared the artifact belonged to the people of Mima. Plus, getting the whole menagerie back to Galaway was beyond her logical capabilities at the moment. She scratched her head in bewilderment and noticed the light of dawn. In that strange light, from the odd angle, it seemed that the rock over the shield contained a face. The light shifted minutely, and she could have sworn that she saw the letter M carved in the cliff. The light shifted again, and she saw only rock. Brishee shook her head in negation. She had enough on her mind without fantastic visions. She knew she had to move her band and decided if Larry was part of the process, well, was his life worth the lives of the rest of them? And if not, at what point did she order them to cut and run? What gave her the right to say who lived and who died? Her only thought at the beginning had been to escape her slavery. She briefly entertained the thought of just taking off and not looking back. But she couldn't do that. Brishee knew she was going to take care of her charges. She just didn't know how. The sun fully clearing... I'm going to go after 8. I'm sorry. I'm kind of going as fast as I can. The sun fully clearing the horizon should have been a joyous moment for Brishee, but she happened to glance at the cliff's face. She saw again the vaguely familiar face in the rock, willing her to do something. Brishee cowered before her image, unable to do more than shake with a sudden chill and question her own worth. The face of the rock had challenged her. Its very being had asked her who she was and what she was doing. It was an unwelcome question. Cruith stirred and suddenly sat up from her scruffy mound. She moved as if entranced toward the rock face. Larry still hung there, supported by Maddie. Larry's arm was still trapped in the shield. Maddie stood one rung below him, supporting his weight across her shoulders. Above the shield and the rock remained the outlines of a known face. Cruith confirmed it by laying her hands on the rock and naming him. Prince Monaghan. Brishee sat back on her haunches and tried to remember what it was like to be insane. And at that instant, she didn't see much difference between being insane and leading a quest. Cruith's cries of, "Monaghan! Monaghan! Prince Monaghan, he's here! Here in the rock!" woke up the whole camp. How Cruith knew it was Monaghan, she never really explained. "Oh, now your quest is complete." Percy's rasp was heard from only a few yards away. He twisted the arm with the child and that he held hard enough for the boy to cry out. All heads turned in his direction, and Ross snorted awake. The party, with the exception of Larry, fanned out to meet Percy. Ross scrambled to his feet and stood against the cliff, shaking his head and snorting. Percy moved toward them. He had shifted his grip on the boy, and he now held him by the hair in one hand and pressed the point of his slime snake horn against the lad's neck. "I'll have the shield and the artifact, or I'll drink this little one's blood before your eyes." "Ew." Cruith stepped forward. "I can give you the artifact, but only if you release the boy." She held up the gleaming crystal in the sunlight. Percy relaxed for a moment, and it looked as if he was going to take the trade. Then he came back to himself. "All of you will drop your weapons and move over by the horse. Do it now." The horn pressed harder against the boy's throat, and the lad screamed in terror. "No!" Brishee knew that she didn't have much to bargain for the life of the boy, but she knew once they laid down their weapons, they would have nothing at all. "Let the boy go, and we'll lay down our weapons." "Lay down your weapons and step aside, and then I'll let the boy go." Percy and Brishee locked eyes for a long moment. "You kill the boy, and we'll kill you. It's as simple as that. I don't know who you are, but you can't be that stupid or that crazy." Brishee'd been around enough dickering to know that you never take the second offer. "He's crazy, Brishee," spoke Larry from the shield. "He'll kill the child just for spite. Let him through. If he doesn't release the boy by the time he's still 2 paces from the shield, do your best to kill him. You still have to get the shield from me, Uncle." "Oh, I've a plan for that. First, though, throw down your weapons, all but the old woman. Move aside. Old woman, put that artifact in your left hand and hold it out to me." Finally, Brishee sighed and nodded. She let her sword fall in the dust and walked to where Ross stood. Everyone followed suit, and soon all but Cruith stood against the wall. Cruith's hand trembled only a little as she held out the artifact. Percy moved awkwardly, pushing the boy in front of him. He'd had to shift his grip on the child. Percy's quaking hand was scant inches from the artifact when Cruith moved. She had waited until Percy's attention was completely on the artifact before she closed her fingers about it and grabbed the arm of the boy. Percy, however, was quicker than she anticipated and kept his grip on the boy. It was a desperate tug-of-war between the mad man and the wise woman. The boy in between, his bloodless face seeming to be only eyes and mouth, was too terrified to scream. "Drop it, hag, or move over with the rest of them," Percy said calmly, bringing the horn once more to the boy's throat. Cruith let go of the boy's arm but kept the artifact. Why is it you want this? Because it's so shiny and pretty, or do you want it because you know what it can do? Percy was taken aback. Why did he want the artifact and the shield? The madness swelled in his brain, and he swayed a little on his feet. His eyes closed for a dreamy second and then snapped open even wider, wilder than they were before. The kingdom! That's why he wanted them. But how? Would the artifact and the shield give him the kingdom? Suddenly it occurred to him that his logic wasn't all it could be. The old witch was right. He needed information. What was her game? Was she trying to stall, or did she know something that she wanted to trade for power and status? Why not find out if she knew anything? And if she did, let her live for a while. What do you know, old one? I know you'll never move that shield from that rock without my help. What do you know? Spittle flew from Percy's lips as he screamed at her. That one, said Cruith, pointing at Brishee, that one is a virgin. If she inserts the key to the mountain in the center of the shield, the mountain will open up and free the army of the damned. They will be yours to command. The army of the damned can't be killed. They eat the bodies of the conquered, and they will all be loyal to you through eternity. Sounds good. Drop the artifact where you are, and you, pointed at Brishee, pick it up and do as she said. Percy stood between the main group where Brishee was fitting the artifact into the shield underneath Larry's arm. It does. It cuts down on lag. Just don't derez the reser, that's all. Percy still had his hostage, and although his attention was divided, it was not equal. The majority of his interest was focused on what was going on with Brishee and Larry. When he wasn't looking at them, Elfane took a chance to whisper to Cruith, "What did you do that for? Why did you give him an invincible army?" "There's no army of the damned, you fool. I just made that up," Cruith whispered back. "What if the mountain splits again and we're all What if the mountain splits again and we're all crushed?" asked Dugan. "Well, at least the bastard will die with us, and he won't have the artifact or the shield." "Oh, it would be worth my life to see his guts," growled Maddie, "but not worth the life of that child." As before, the crystal sunk into the metal of the shield. Yeah, boy, that's a good lie. Just keep that one ready. Before the crystal sunk into the metal of the shield, Brishee, as instructed by Cruith, turned it a quarter turn counterclockwise. The shield began to hum and vibrate. Percy had waited long enough. He pushed the boy away, grabbed up Dugan's sword from where it lay in the dust, and with a wild cry that came from his throat as he raised the blade, two-handed above his head, and charged at Larry. Larry saw him coming, and with his free hand pushed Brishee to the side and behind him. Larry kicked out with one foot, but it didn't even slow Percy down as he charged, chopped with the big sword, severing Larry's left arm at the shoulder. Free at last of the ladder and the shield, Larry fell beside Brishee, passing out with shock. Brishee don't worry, it's not over. Brishee instinctively clutched Larry to her, pressing the bleeding shoulder to her breast and squeezing him tight. Before she could act, the spurting blood spattered the shield. Where it landed, Larry's blood began to boil and crackle. A small whirlwind passed the stunned party, and the mountain indeed did split, but this time only a little and vertically. Just to the left of the shield, the rock moved aside, and Monaghan stepped out of the rock, not a day older than when he was first entombed within it. Percy had a hold of Larry's arm now, which was still in the straps of the shield. Still glowing in the center was the artifact. More whirlwinds moved through the camp, and Ross snorted again. The shield began to glow and pulse. It seemed to move a little toward Larry, and then off in another direction, and then back toward Larry. Percy kept a hold of the severed arm, even though the shield towed him back and forth. Elfane would never know what gave him the presence of mind to do it, but he was forever glad that he did, a little sad, too. He whacked Ross so hard across the rump that his hand stung for days afterward. Ross shot forward, screaming a hoarse scream. The scream was part fear, part outrage, and mostly hatred for Percy. Percy saw him coming, but managed to get behind the shield enough to not be trampled below Ross's feet, but not enough to fend off the impact of the collision of the big animal. For an instant, everything seemed to stop, and everything seemed to happen at once. Percy was flying backwards. Ross was trying frantically to stop. The blinding light flashed from the shield, and then straps fell loose from Larry's arm, and Percy flew backward into the mountain, still holding the severed limb, looking stupidly as if it had betrayed him. The rock snapped shut just as Ross lost his battle with inertia and gravity. His head came up. He gave a last proud whinny before skidding over the side and falling to his death on the rocks, hundreds of feet below. "Quick! All of you, get on the ladder!" It was the voice of Monaghan, deep and used to command. The shield began to pulse faster. Elfane and Dugan ran to where Brishee held Larry and lifted them both to the ladder. The two men took up positions on either side of the couple and squeezed them tight. Brishee still had Larry's wound pressed to her, and the bleeding seemed to be slowing. Although she couldn't be sure, soon Maddie, the Memons, Cruith, at last, and Monaghan were on the ladder. The shield pulsed once more and began to fly, constantly picking up speed, taking them back the way it had came. The last thing Maddie saw clearly before they got too high to make out details was Ross's wrecked body at the foot of the mountain. When Larry first opened his eyes, all he saw was a moving ceiling. He turned his head to the left, and he saw the wall moving. He realized he was horizontal. And from the jerks and jounces he was being carried, perhaps on a stretcher, Larry looked toward his toes and saw a man's back. A man that looked an awful lot like his father. He looked up and saw Monaghan's face, upside down. Larry was flopped down, and other things that had been piled on the stretcher were taken off. Monaghan placed the lost artifact on its pedestal. Willy reverently hung the shield of many uses back on its place on the wall. "Oh, you're awake." It was Monaghan who noticed. Willy turned from where he was eyeing the shield, deciding if it hung straight. "Hi, Larry," he said. "We've got a lot to tell you." Larry suddenly noticed that Monaghan wore the crown and Willy's head was uncovered. "What? What have you got to tell me?" "Well, son, I'd first like to say that I'm proud of you. I'm sorry that you were hurt. You've done well in the first part of your service. You'll have to finish it, you understand, but you've done very well." John knocked at the open door and led the rest of the party into the great hall. Thule, the innkeeper, and the schoolteacher followed. John started to automatically bow to Willy. Then he realized that Monaghan now wore the crown, and others were in a similar state of confusion. "Stand easy, all," said Monaghan. "As a matter of fact, why don't you all find a place to sit? Make yourselves comfortable." They sorted themselves out, had all eaten, rested, bathed. They wore new clothes. The women plain dresses tied at the waist with bright sashes, the men plain breeches and sack shirts. All felt uncomfortable sitting before the kings. Just as everyone got settled, a timid knock came at the doorway. All heads turned to see Eugene, cap in hand. Maddie's lips drew back over her teeth in what wasn't a smile. "I wasn't sure if I should come." "Oh, yes, we want you here, Eugene. You are part of this story, too." Willy absently scratched his head, where for so many years a crown had rested. "I suppose I should start by saying that I've abdicated the crown to my older brother Monaghan, even though he now appears to be only a few years older than my son. He is the rightful King of Galaway." Willy stepped up to Monaghan and graced him with a formal bow, and then Willy did a very strange thing. He went and sat with Cruith. Monaghan cleared his throat and addressed them. "Much has changed in the years since I was a prisoner of the mountain. Willy has made me aware of my responsibilities in terms of promised rewards to all of you. I will give those rewards, both those promised and some surprises in a few moments before the people in the courtyard. But we wanted you to be the first to know that Willy has disowned his son." There were gasps at this proclamation. Several forgot themselves and started to speak. Monaghan held up his hands, and there was silence. "I formally adopt Larry. He has begun his testing. I have no heir. It was his blood combined with the others' efforts that unlocked the mountain and gave me freedom. He will finish his year in a day, of course, but after me he will become king. Now, to the courtyard. The people are gathering." For all the hubbub that had coursed through the streets of Galaway's capital city in the past few days, it was surprisingly quiet and calm the day after the first public proclamations of King Monaghan. No one was punished for the almost open rebellion, although some citizens took a few days to hang their heads and stick close to home. As usual, when a new king takes the throne of Galaway, a general amnesty is declared, and the dungeons emptied of all but the most violent criminals. Monaghan had kept all of Willy's promises and made a few changes of his own. He gave all who were involved with the quest, including the Memons and Jean and Eugene, 500 gold pieces. On top of that, he paid Maddie the sum promised to her if she could prove whether or not Larry was cheating on the test of kings. He paid Brishee this reward and her salary, declaring that he still wished to retain her and her servant for another quest. What he wanted them to do, he did not yet specify. Elfane was retained as a royal historian, and would, at the king's leisure, record the story of how Monaghan had become a prisoner in the mountain. Eugene's part in the plot was revealed, and his treachery forgiven. Monaghan forgave him, but anyone who looked at Maddie's eyes figured there'd be a private reckoning. The Memans were given citizenship, including the one surviving child. The boy would be educated and raised in the castle. Willy's grand chicken house would be remodeled into a school, and the teacher, awfully, would preside over the institution, who you didn't hear about because I had to cut out that part, would preside over this institution, as well as set up free schools in all corners of the kingdom. Dugan was to become commander of the palace guard. After that great feast was given right there in the courtyard, under the light of stars and torches, everyone was encouraged by Monaghan to eat and drink and make merry. So it was that the first full day of Monaghan's rule started out with everyone getting up a little later than usual, perhaps a little tired, but with a good deal of cheer, and looking to a future that none of them could have imagined a few weeks ago. I'm going to skip this part where John and Eugene go to the Feathered Pig, and they ask Maddie to buy it. And she gives them a little bit of a hard time about it, but ultimately Maddie and John and Eugene become partners. A charming old couple was taking their leave of the king in the courtyard. Willy and Cruith were aboard their wagon and almost ready to leave when two more people came to say goodbye. Brishee hugged Cruith, kissed Willy's hand. Larry walked up the side of the wagon and placed his hand on his father's knee. "Should you be up so soon, son?" "I have something to say to you, Dad." "What is that, Larry?" "Well, I want to say, I wanted you to know that I've taken those lessons you wanted me to learn to heart, and that even with all that happened, I'm grateful to you, and I love you." Willy cleared his throat and said in a voice so tiny that only a few could hear his words, "I guess I was a good king after all." Cruith snapped the reins of the horse on the horse's rumps and cackled, "Well, back to the sea-coast, Willy?" "Yes, back to the coast, Cruith." Monaghan gestured to his man, Tully. Tully wasn't sure if his new position was punishment or reward, but he snapped to and bowed before his king. "Tully, lay tea and cakes in the library. Come, Elfane, I have a story to tell you." Monaghan and Elfane paused beside Larry and Brishee while they watched Cruith and Willy clatter out through the gates. Also watching was the latest addition to the royal stables. A young stallion, although born just the day before, was more than steady on his feet. The colt even managed to aim and land a kick on the stable boy's knee as he passed. "Damn!" said the boy as he rubbed the spot. "That one's got a mind of his own." Little Ross tossed his head and bounded over to his mother, wanting his breakfast. The end.